Hello, welcome to the Counting the Earth podcast from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. I'm Alice Hope,
And I'm Sue Nelson. Throughout this podcast series, we explore the environment and the natural world, always through the lens of one number.
and today's number is a humongous one, 50 trillion. And that is an estimate of the number of earthworms in the UK.
Because this time we're taking a look at that overlooked invertebrate, why it's a soil superhero, and why we should care about the state of our soils.
Coming up, I will be digging for earthworms with an invertebrate expert and discovering what amazing soil engineers they are.
We'll be speaking to the National Earthworm Recorder. Yes, it is a job about bringing AI to earthworm recognition.
And we'll hear from Ellen Fay from Sustainable Soils Alliance about why healthy soils matter. Now, I should say, Sue, when we started discussing an episode on earthworms, I couldn't get that song out of my head. Do you know the one I mean? You're
Oh,
like,
no.
nobody likes me, everybody hates me, think I'll go and eat worms. Big, fat, juicy ones, long, thin,
Okay,
slimy worms, itsy bitsy, fuzzy, wuzzy worms.
thank you, Alice. I think we'll we'll go there. Okay, then. So 50 trillion worms. That's actually a million worms in the UK. That's just the UK. Such a huge number. I'm finding it quite difficult to get my head around.
Well, we should say that is a very rough estimate, but to help you visualize that a bit better, another back of the envelope calculation is that if a UK earthworm weighs around 0.15 grams, then 50 trillion of them corresponds to around 1.5 million elephants, with an elephant weighing in at about 5 metric
Oh
tons.
my goodness. I love these units of mass of earthworms and now elephants. Either way, that is a lot of biomass. And I now have a slightly disturbing image of an elephant entirely made up of squirming worms now. But I don't know whether you know this, Alice. I found this out in my research, but earthworms had superfans. First of all, Aristotle, who called earthworms the intestines of the earth. And also Charles Darwin, who spent 40 years observing their behaviour and eventually wrote a whole book on them called The Formation of Vegetable Mould Through the Action of Worms, through observations of their behaviour. Not exactly a catchy title, but it was observing the different densities of populations in a kitchen garden versus a cornfield or a forest, how they're integral to the cycling of plant matter, and he even pinned leaves to the ground so that he could watch them try to pull them down into their burrows. This was Darwin's last publication, but despite being focused on a far less flashy subject, perhaps, than Galapagos wildlife, believe it or not, that book became a bestseller. And what they were both paying tribute to was both the value of earthworms to the health of our soils and the value of our soils to the health of the world.
Darwin isn't the only super fan. I mean, let's face it, they're really fascinating for children. I remember as a child being told if you cut worms in half that you get two worms. So off I went with a trowel determined to double the garden's population. But this is one of the facts and fictions I explored when I went digging for worms with UKCEH invertebrate expert Dr. Alex Robinson on his allotment. Oh, there you go, there's one.
There's a surprising number of earthworms you might actually find in your garden on a day-to-day basis. This guy we just found is quite fun. This is called Aparectidea longa. It's probably the second longest earthworm in the country. It might be called the grey-headed worm, but you can see they can reach about 15 or 20 centimetres or so. It's very difficult to identify juvenile earthworms. It's also quite important to be able to work out if they're adults or not. So it's important to tell first if they've got what's known as a saddle, about a quarter to a third of the way along.
And that's that sort of pink band that you get around an earthworm.
Yes, it's where their reproductive organs are housed. If they've got a saddle, it's possible to tell what species it is reasonably easily. There's an excellent key online that you can download. If you look up the Opal Earthworm Project, That will guide you through the common species that you're likely to find in your garden. The UK has about 30 species of earthworm. While that may seem a lot, that's actually probably a lot fewer than we ought to have. During the last ice age, all earthworms in the UK were wiped out. And then in the Holocene, they started to migrate north from Europe. However, the English Channel formed before more than about half of them had got here. So our 30 species is relatively impoverished compared to somewhere like France.
Oh, those are a couple of really big ones. They're quite pale, those ones.
So yeah, this is probably my favourite earthworm species. It's called Octolassian cyaneum, and they're a big, fat, somewhat alien looking blue worm, magnificently disgusting looking, kind of translucent. You can even see yellow patches through them. One of the key ways you can classify earthworms is not just by their taxonomy, but also by their function within the environment. There are four main types. You've got the stripy tiger worms that you might find in your compost heap, and they're not strictly a true earthworm. But then within the true earthworms, you've got three main habitats. You could have epigeic worms that live mostly in the leaf litter, or you've got anesic worms, which form permanent vertical burrows. They'll live in these vertical burrows and drag leaf litter down from the surface.
And so they draw the leaf litter down, but they must live quite a bit deeper then.
Yes, they can live really quite deep. In the winter you might find them at 15 to 30 centimetres. Finally you get the endogeic worms, which form horizontal burrows within the soil, and they might be at around 15 up to 15 centimetres deep.
Looking at the worms that we've got here in your allotment, we've got quite a big difference in length and in colour. Are these smaller worms juveniles, or are they just smaller species?
So for most of these, they're smaller species. The very largest species would be the Aparectidae longa, the Octolassian cyaneum, and then the very biggest of all in the UK, Lumbricus terrestris. Terrestris actually scores reasonably well on a global scale for a big chunky worm. We're never going to quite manage to meet the Australian giant earthworm. I think it's the Gippsland earthworm. That can get up to about 3 metres long. But
Oh my god, that's amazing.
a big chunky terrestris might reach 30 centimetres. Let's just see if we can find a couple more species. This one will do. So this one's quite fun. This is called Aloabora chlorotica. It's a small earthworm, maybe about 3 centimetres long.
It's very yellow.
Yeah, they're gloriously disgusting in their colours. They've got two main colour morphs. There's a pink version, and then this one, which is a sort of a disgusting yellow-green kind of colour. But these are always easy to identify because you see how this one's tied itself into a bit of a knot, tangles itself up. It's the only UK species to tangle itself into a ball when you handle it, so they're quite easy to find. Oh, and then this is a final one. It's an earthworm cocoon. Each will contain several eggs that will hatch into juvenile earthworms. Depending on the species, they might be from about 1.5 to 5 millimetres across. Earthworm cocoons tend to have a slightly pointed end and look a bit more like seeds. And you can see it's got that tiny little stalk at one end that the much rounder slug eggs won't have. And actually, sieving for cocoons is a very important part of our work, to look at the effect that a pesticide, for example, might be having on earthworms.
Right, shall we return all of these back from whence they came and let them crack on with nibbling on the soil? Our opening number for this episode is 50 trillion, which is the estimate of the number of earthworms in the United Kingdom. How did we get to that number?
I've got my colleague Aidan to thank for that number. The way he's come to it is he's looked at the different categories of land cover within the UK and then taken estimates for the number of earthworms per square metre within those different land types. In the most abundant land types, you might be getting as many as 300 or 400 earthworms per square metre. And so once scaled up to the UK, you do end up with this fantastically huge number. Estimates like this are very much approximate. It's important to get an order of magnitude type measurement, we could be out by a factor of 10 and would still count that as a good result.
I suppose it would be impossible to ever know the real number of earthworms. But what it does tell us is just how abundant earthworms are. I mean, 50 trillion is an incredibly large number.
Yeah, invertebrates are ridiculously numerous. It can be sometimes quite difficult to get our heads around the scale of numbers involved when you start trying to think about individuals.
Why is it that earthworms are so valuable to us?
So earthworms play a fairly key role in maintaining good soil health. They're one of the most important groups for breaking down organic matter within the soil. They'll work through dead plant material and incorporate it into the soil. There's quite a fun field site that we went to down in Avonmouth near Bristol, and it's the site of an old zinc smelter which has led to huge heavy metal pollution within the soil. The soil itself looks completely different to what you find in a healthy system. With the absence of almost all soil invertebrates, particularly earthworms, there's nothing there to break down the plant material. So you end up with a very bizarre, thick, spongy layer of thatch and then thin, quite sandy soil underneath it. In the absence of pollution, this would all be mixed together and be a much more rich, fertile and diverse soil. It's recently been estimated that earthworms are responsible for about 6.5% of global grain production. There was a paper in Nature recently. Indeed, having high numbers of earthworms can actually help not only with soil health in terms of productivity, but also in terms of soil carbon sequestration.
While I've got a worm expert with me, I did want to take the opportunity to ask a question that has confused me since I was a child. Is it really true that if you chop a worm in half, it turns into two different worms?
No, unfortunately not. Earthworms are quite good at regenerating, so if they lose a section of their tail, they're capable of regrowing it. Under some circumstances, they can even regrow bits of their head. However, if you cut them in half, at best only one half is going to survive, and there's every chance that neither half will, so please don't cut earthworms up.
Thank you to Dr. Alex Robinson for showing me his allotment and lots of juicy worms.
And you won't be cutting up earthworms again anytime soon, I'm assuming, Alex.
No, lesson learned there, I think.
I enjoyed listening to that. It's made me think about earthworms in a different way and also consider their beauty, which is something I never thought I would have said, and to look for those colours.
Yeah, I was really surprised actually. It's not until you get them all next to each other that you realise how different they all are. Some of them were really blue or pink or even sort of a greeny colour, a lot more variety than I was expecting.
Yes, and it's good to hear how important they are when it comes to our soils. And a lovely example of being out in the countryside, because was that a red kite I could hear in the background?
Yes, we had red kites wheeling overhead the whole time. I mean, they were probably hoping for a meal. They're one of the many species that earthworms are a food source for, along with birds of all sizes, really, reptiles, and even mammals like hedgehogs and foxes and badgers as well.
And we also discovered how critical they are to helping soil function as a key pillar of our environment.
Absolutely. Food production, flood mitigation, and carbon sequestration. I mean, worms help the soil function as it should. They really are so important.
And I had no idea there were so many species of worms either. So, yeah, I'd learnt quite a lot there.
Yeah, I know. Around 30 different species of worms seemed a lot to me too, but globally, there are around 3,700 known species of earthworms. But scientists estimate in reality there are many, many more yet to be discovered, and there could be up to 7,000 species across the soils of the world.
Well, to find out more about what we know of our 30 species, we spoke to Kieran Brown, who is the UK's National Recorder for Earthworms, a voluntary position with a big impact, since he collates data on earthworm species across Britain into a central data set for research, something, as we found out, is vital. Alice has already had the enviable job of going out and looking at worms in detail. How do they train you to identify the worms? Because for a lot of people, they do all look the same.
We've got 31 species of earthworm in the UK, and telling them apart can be quite tricky. So we can be looking at things like tiny little grooves on their head. We can be looking at the distance between hairs or setae on each segment. So these are really, really fine details that you do need a still earthworm under a microscope to be able to tell the difference. In 2012, there was a scientific paper that did the first ever look at UK earthworms and what we knew about them in terms of species records and distribution. And their conclusion was really that we knew very little, and that the data that we had wasn't comprehensive enough to say very much about any species at all. So the Earthworm Society of Britain was formed with its main aim to encourage more recording of earthworms so that we have better data, so that we can think about things like conserving any earthworms that might be endangered.
Are there any efforts underway to simplify that process and make it easier to tell the difference between different earthworm species?
I've been working with the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology on a project which we've termed the Earthworm Image Recognition Project, which is investigating the possibility of using image recognition technology and AI to identify earthworms from live photos. Now, identifying earthworms live is not something that we as humans can currently do. That isn't to say it's not possible, it's just that we don't have the data on live earthworms to be able to do that. And earthworms can be extremely variable because their colour can be down to a number of different things. So it can be down to whatever they're eating, it can be down to pigmentation cells, etc.
This effort to take the images to train the software and to get the records, that's been on a national scale, hasn't it?
I've been up and down England, as far north as North Yorkshire. I surveyed West Yorkshire, Derbyshire, Buckinghamshire, and to one site in Wales to make sure that we've got good representative data from across a relatively broad geographic range. And that's been a little bit limited. I couldn't get Scotland or Northern Ireland because of travel budget constraints. But these different sites that I've got to, I've had volunteers coming along. The images that we've been gathering are not high quality specialist wildlife photography images.
Oh.
Some of them are quite blurry, they're not very focused. And that's because we've been getting people to photograph the earthworms just using their mobile devices. Because if we're going to train an algorithm to identify earthworms, it needs to be with the kind of data that it would have access to if it was in actual use.
So basically exactly like I would do it if I'm doing a wildflower, is like I get out my phone, take a picture, and some of them turn out well, and some of them when I look back at them I think, oh, that's a bit blurry.
Exactly.
I've got an app on my phone that identifies wildflowers and fungi. Could there potentially be a day when we get an app that identifies earthworms?
The images that I've been gathering, we haven't had a chance to analyse that and put it through the algorithm yet, so we don't actually know. I think the reality is that it may be able to pick up a few more distinctive species, but there's probably going to be species that it's never going to be able to separate out. The surveying that we've done has had other benefits as well. So in addition to gathering the images, all of the data that we've been gathering on the actual earthworms themselves and where they are has been going into those data sets that I mentioned earlier. And because earthworms are so undersampled, we're still finding out new things all the time. So to give you an example, myself and the volunteers that were surveying a park in Leeds found 3 species that had never been found in that area before. And what's really interesting is that these species were not rare species. One of them is possibly the most common species that we've got in the UK. So this just really gives you a flavour of how little we know about earthworms, about where they are and what we've got.
Now, you mentioned impact on data that your work's having. What impact are worms having on soil?
Earthworms have many impacts on soil. So earthworms are what we call ecosystem engineers, and that means that they create the environment they live in. So earthworms are involved in many different soil processes, from processes such as the actual creation of soil aggregates. The particular structure that soil has is dependent on earthworms. They also burrow through the earth, so they affect the structure in that way, creating drainage, creating aeration of the surfaces for the soil. They also break down chemical components into formats that can be taken up by plants, so they're really important for plant growth.
even in your back garden, let alone out in nature, the more worms you have, the better your plants will grow.
In theory, but I would caveat that a little bit with it's not just about numbers of earthworms. Like I said, we've got 31 different species of earthworm, and different species do different things. Our understanding at a species level of what different earthworms do still leaves a lot to be desired. There's still a lot we need to learn, but you can roughly break them down into different groups that do different jobs. So some live above the ground and break down plant and animal waste, so things like cow pats, our compost, leaves, deadwood. Some live in the soil and eat the soil and break that down further. So, and some live quite deep and they'll eat leaves from above ground. They'll come out at night to forage, and they'll be also consuming the really nutrient poor deep soil, and that will all be getting mixed up in their gut. They're providing slightly different services depending on it is. So what I would say is in your garden soils, what you want are lots of earthworms, but also lots of different types of earthworm.
I think earthworms are a little bit overlooked. So, what is it that people can do to really look after their earthworms in their garden or their allotment?
So considering that we've got lots of different types of earthworms inhabiting our gardens, we want to think about actions that can help those different types of earthworm. One thing that anybody can do, and it's not just good for earthworms, it's good for our carbon footprint as well, is to compost our own waste, so it's not getting taken away from our home and it's getting dealt with on site, and we get a really nice product afterwards that's useful for our garden in the form of compost that we can spread on our flower beds, etc. And another thing that I try and advise people is what a lot of people don't realise is some of our rarer earthworms are wet soil specialists, so they really thrive when conditions are wet. So if you've got any kind of wetland feature in your garden, that's great for earthworms. So things like a garden pond or a little bog area are absolutely fantastic for earthworm diversity.
You know what? I'm feeling a little guilty now because we kept chickens in our back garden for about 10 years in total, I reckon. And when I found worms, well, I think you can guess what we did, what we did to them. I'm so sorry, Kieran.
That's fine, that's fine. My bigger concern is the people that pave over their gardens and lay down plastic lawns, to be honest.
Kieran Brown there, and it's lovely to hear the sort of importance of volunteers in helping us understand more about not just earthworms and nature, but our soil as well, and how important they're all sort of combined, aren't they, and intermingled.
They are. And I think what really struck me was how little we know about earthworms. You know, you turn over soil in the garden or you see them on the pavement after it's rained. They're something that we see really regularly, and yet we actually don't know as much about them as we do some other species.
Yes, that lack of data was quite a surprise to me as well, but it only highlights the importance of the work he's doing.
Absolutely. And we did, of course, learn that we need to give our worms space to breathe and maybe don't feed them to your chickens. So I think the
Sorry.
worldwide worm community is probably breathing a sigh of relief that you no longer keep poultry. Although I am going to ask, what were your chickens called?
Well, because we're all sci-fi fans in our household, our sort of most memorable, our first collection of three were all Star Wars names. So they were Hen Solo, Princess Leia, and Imperial Storm Chicken.
Brilliant.
Anyway, it's amazing that for something as commonplace as earthworms that we know so little about their distribution across the country. I'm certainly going to pay more attention now if I'm ever out digging in my garden. I will certainly look at worms with a lot more respect in terms of what they do for our soils.
Now, we have been doing a deep dive on earthworms today in the hope that we can show just how much more complex and interesting they are than the slimy things of children's songs and horror films. But we are also discussing them because of their huge importance, as you just said, Sue, to soil health. And that is the domain of our final guest, Ellen Fay, the founder and executive director of the Sustainable Soils Alliance. We've been talking a lot today about worms and their role in creating a healthy soil, but they aren't the only living things that contribute to healthy soils, are they?
No, they're not. They are wonderful because they are clearly established in our imagination, aren't they? I mean, They are present in children's games and children's stories right the way through our lives until when we die and we think about the worms helping us to return to the earth, as it were. But actually, the soil is teeming with life. I think it's right to say that there's more than about a quarter of all the world's biodiversity lives in the soil. So there's a lot more going on beneath our feet than just the earthworms, certainly.
There is, and because a lot of the organisms are so small, I think as humans we forget just how much there is in the soil.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It was Leonardo da Vinci who said, centuries ago, that we know much more about the stars in the universe than we do about the world beneath our feet, as it were.
Why is having a healthy soil so important?
Healthy soils are pivotal to the health of pretty much every other part of our environment. Soils store much more carbon than is stored in the atmosphere. Soils are absolutely critical to water filtration and water storage. So in this country, we know that our soils store more water than all our rivers and lakes combined. And actually, in terms of filtration of water, they're also completely critical. I think it's something like 1 hectare of soil can filter enough water for 1,000 people for a year. It just makes you realize, where would we be without healthy soils? Soil is teeming with biodiversity itself, but it's also critical to all above ground biodiversity because it supports all of life.
Because they're so important, it's important for us to understand what state our soils are in. So how are the world's soils doing at the moment?
In this country, it's actually a little bit difficult for us to say because soils have not enjoyed the prioritisation that other parts of the environment have. So we don't have a very clear picture at the moment about the health and the state of the soils in this country, but there is a lot of work afoot to put that right at the moment. There was a piece of work done recently, though, that established that 60 to 70% of European soils are degraded. And there's absolutely no reason to believe that things in any specific parts of the UK are much better than that. So, not a good picture at the moment.
In that case, how can we improve our soils?
I think one of the key ways that we can start to improve our soils is through better understanding about soil itself. I mean, soil is complex. In this country, for example, we have more than 700 different soil types. So soil isn't just one thing. Soil is a kind of ecosystem in itself of different types of soil that react and act in different ways because they've been formed over millennia according to different circumstances. So understanding soil at that kind of, very granular level is really, really important in order to then create mechanisms that are more simple but based on fundamental truths about soil that can help people to understand soil better. But there's a lot of movement in that area sort of scientifically in order to start to create a more harmonized idea about soils across the landscape that we can communicate better to those who manage soils, and also to form the basis of really useful and robust mechanisms for teaching about soils better. And I think it would be lovely if children, right through from primary school age, right through to when they leave school, were getting familiar and interested in that diversity of soils and what that means for their management as well.
Can I just ask if there's a chemical solution to this? Now, I know this is considered controversial, but many people will put fertilizer to improve soils, organic or otherwise. Is there a sort of temporary fix to soil quality?
I think this goes back to what I was saying about having an understanding about soils, a deeper understanding about them and how they function. If you think of soil in terms of its structure, if something doesn't have structure, you can't really do very much to build other parts of it, if you like, or strengthen other parts of it because it won't be supported. And the way that soils are lost by being washed away or things washing off them, fertilizers washing off them into the watercourse, And that is what causes big problems in aquatic life, etc. That is because the soil is not of sound heart and it is not able to hold things on the land. So loading chemicals onto a soil that is degraded is an incredibly short-term solution to anything, because the other problems that we've already mentioned can't be addressed by that. So I think we need to be thinking holistically about the solutions that we need to natural degradation. Nature does not work in a compartmentalized way.
What will happen if we don't look after our soils, if we don't do those things that you've described?
We've seen horrible examples this year of half a field sort of ending up in somebody's kitchen as it's sort of washed down a hill and into villages. We have real problems in our rivers, algal blooms, etc., as things aren't held on the land as they need to be by healthy soils. Obviously, there are huge implications for food security. Compacted soils simply won't produce the crops that we need or feed the animals in the way that we need to feed them. And soils are also, being so important for biodiversity, you see knock-on effects everywhere. Certainly when this government first introduced the idea of incentivising farmers to look after the soil, which is still a work in progress, but the idea behind that was very much that if you take care of the soil, then everything else starts to fall into place.
Thank you very much to Ellen Fay from the Sustainable Soils Alliance for chatting to us. And I was really taken with this idea of soils as a carbon store. I don't think it's something that's talked about quite as much as some of the other carbon stores like forests and things like that. And I saw a stat recently that soils globally store 3 times more carbon than all of the plant matter across the world, which is just a massive amount and could really make a difference.
Absolutely. And also, soils store more water than is in our rivers and lakes combined. I mean, that is another sort of equally sort of gobsmacking fact, quite frankly.
Definitely. And another thing I took away from that was the stat about soils being degraded. I mean, 60 to 70% of soils, whether that's because they're compacted or polluted or depleted in organic matter, that's an awful lot of Europe that has degraded soils.
And that's important because there was a paper a couple of years ago that was reflecting on how human societies are dependent upon soils for food production, but also the rise and fall of numerous civilizations from Mesopotamia to the Mayans have been tied to overexploitation of the land and soil degradation. So, yes, the importance of soil cannot be stressed enough.
And of course, one of the key components to soil health is a healthy population of earthworms. And I have certainly got a newfound interest in these amazing invertebrates.
Me too. And we hope you've developed a new respect for those soil engineers working away in our gardens and fields. And if you'd like to learn more about earthworms that you might find in your garden, there's an excellent diagram of their different habitats on the Earthworm Society's website. And we'll put a link to them in the description on the podcast, on the website, and also on UKCEH social media, as well as a link to the opal worm identification chart. I think that's a must for me, that Alex mentioned earlier, to help you try and pick out some of those more distinct species.
And that is it for Counting the Earth on earthworms and soil health. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and please join us next time for more conversations about nature and numbers.